Power disintegrates in many forms, yet none so hideous as the unraveling of King Philip II of Spain. Once the architect of a world-spanning empire, he confronted not crowned adversaries, nor insubordinate legions, but a silent usurper gnawing beneath his own skin, his flesh surrendering cell by cell to rot and infestation. El Escorial, that colossal stone labyrinth, brooded over the landscape and over its master, the summer air within thick with candle smoke prayers and the stench of corruption. Here in 1598, amid the winding corridors and cavernous silence, grandeur warped into something funereal. Shadows flickered over marble and tapestries as Philip, son of the vanished emperor Charles V, lay captive in a bed no longer a throne, but a tomb in waiting. His dominion, once so vast that dawn and dusk pursued it across oceans, meant nothing to the worms gathering beneath his bandages, to the insects trailing from festering sores, to the agony twisting his nights into endless delirium. Faith offered no refuge. The old king's muttered orisons echoed through the palace, as if the stones themselves recoiled from his despair. He had hurled fleets against distant England, sent armies into the meat grinder of Europe, declared himself hammer of heresy, yet no crusade could halt the slow, obscene mutiny inside his body. Day after suffocating day, the sun burned pitilessly on the palace roofs, and Philip, immobilized, was picked apart by maladies invisible and implacable. His blood, once the conduit of dynasties, ran foul. His breath grew shallow. Around him physicians whispered and servants shrank into doorways, terror-struck by the stench of royal decay. These final agonies did not spare him dignity. They stripped it from him piece by piece. Chronicler Sigüenza among them recorded horrors that seemed the stuff of fever or nightmare, yet the verdict of modern medicine is sober. Every wound, every maggot, every groan was real. The palace, conceived as an eternal monument, became instead a suffocating vault, its every corridor haunted by the slow undoing of its maker. This is not merely the chronicle of torment, though the pain was monstrous and unrelenting. It is the study of power laid bare, stripped of armor and ceremony, before the tribunal of death. For Philip, the final reckoning came not as a rival in arms, but as the quiet, cold democracy of decay. In the end, even kings rot, and the stones of their palaces remember. As we peel back the ornate royal bedsheets to reveal the rotting form beneath, we are reminded that in the end, even kings return to dust, sometimes while still drawing breath, sometimes by inches, sometimes as living feasts for the lowest creatures of creation. The dignity of majesty could not disguise the horror. Philip II, ruler of continents, was now a banquet for creatures that thrived on rot. It began, as death often does, in silence, a faint warning masked by ceremony and prayer. Spring of 1598 marked the first unmistakable cracks in the royal edifice. 71 years old, Philip had outlived many adversaries, but had not escaped his own body's betrayals. Gout had ravaged him for decades, curling his hands and feet into claws unfit for pen or scepter, every step an ordeal, every signature a spasm of pain. Each attack left him more crippled, pain radiating through bone and sinew, spreading, settling, never retreating. Arthritis claimed what gout had, not freezing his joints, until courtiers whispered of a monarch who could no longer scratch his own brow. By 1591, fevers and agony had anchored him to a wheeled chair, yet he refused surrender. State papers still flowed before his sunken eyes, every decree bearing the sting of his inked no, a single word, and thousands lived or died. But by June, his fortress of will collapsed. Fever, unmerciful and ceaseless, consumed his strength, dissolving lucidity into hallucination. Then abscesses, hot red, pulsing, bursting, and reforming in obscene cycles upon his knee and hand. The remedies, blistering poultices, cruel bloodletting, proved useless, each treatment another humiliation. The infection advanced, devouring his flesh. Within weeks, Philip, master of Spain and the Indies, was marooned in his own bed, motionless save for his head and one trembling arm. No ritual remained to shield him from disgrace. Etiquette, once the iron law of the Escorial, crumbled beneath necessity. The king, who had once been approached only with elaborate genuflection, now lay soiled in his own excrement dignity, drowned beneath the stains and stench when attendants could not change his bedding quickly enough. Even the most loyal servants recoiled, blanching as they changed bedding slick with sweat and worse. Summer pressed down July's heat, thickening the air. The wounds multiplied, festered, gaped, and the room became a charnel house. The odor was unendurable, a slow apocalypse emanating from the body that had once embodied a world's dominion. And so the king of empires withered, a prisoner of flesh and filth, his glory vanishing like breath on a mirror. The stench of rotting flesh seeped through the marble corridors of El Escorial, trailing behind every footstep, so thick that courtiers pressed perfumed cloths to their faces when passing the king's door. Philip, still lucid enough to sense the horror of his own condition, insisted that the windows remain closed, not for comfort but to keep the royal stench from staining the world outside. Even in ruin, pride lingered. Chroniclers spoke of a body blistered with pustules, each sore swelling, bursting, and refilling with blood, and foul matter never healing, only darkening into something worse. In this fevered bed, every shift brought agony, every moment deepened his torment. The sodden sheets, soaked through with royal sweat and decay, became a cradle for infestation. By August, the first lice appeared. Perhaps carried by a servant, perhaps bred from the bedding itself. It scarcely mattered. Philip's body, hot, wet, and defenseless, became a sanctuary for the crawling things. They multiplied with monstrous speed, swarming over his limbs, thriving on the blood and dead flesh that seeped from his wounds. Attendants could not keep pace. They scraped and washed, but new swarms rose up almost instantly. Diego de Yepes, the king's confessor, wrote that lice seemed to breed within the very wounds, emerging from the putrefying flesh itself. True or not, the horror was unrelenting, the mightiest monarch in Europe reduced to a living hive, infested and helpless. Special attendants were assigned to pick the lice from his skin, gathering them in handfuls, an endless futile labor. For hours later his flesh would crawl anew. Yet this was only the surface of Philip's torment. Physician Zamudio de Alfaro recorded that the royal wounds turned foul, breeding putrid matter in which maggots writhed. Flies drawn through cracks and windows found their way to the king's open lesions, laying eggs in royal flesh. Larvae hatched, burrowed, and fed. The palace itself recoiled, its stone heart blackened by rot. Beneath the weight of marble candlelight flickered over the king's ruined body, over crawling insects and festering wounds. All that remained of power was a shell, alive but only barely devoured from within and without. The king had become a feast for lesser creatures, his suffering the true measure of his dominion. A man once treated as semi-divine, whose mere touch was believed by some to heal scrofula, now watched as worms writhed beneath his skin and emerged from his wounds. Every morning servants, pale and trembling, scraped handfuls of maggots from the royal flesh, only to return the next day and find the invasion renewed. Philip II, fully conscious, clung to his faith, whispering, "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me, though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins." The sound of prayers drifted through air thick with rot and fever. By the end of August, new torments revealed themselves. His immobility birthed monstrous bed sores, devouring flesh, fat, and muscle until bone gleamed through the wounds. Chroniclers recoiled from the sight. One ulcer on his hip yawned open so wide that, as Severa de la Torre recorded, one could peer into the king's body itself. From this living abyss, attendants drew enough putrefaction to fill 2 silver basins each day. Maggots bred in this wound, multiplying faster than desperate hands could pluck them away, burrowing deeper when disturbed, feeding on a king not yet dead. Flies swarmed ceaselessly, laying their eggs, not only in dead tissue, but as his strength faded in his mouth, nose, and ears. The monarch who once inspired dread could only endure as insects crawled across his face and vanished inside him. Some believed he suffered from myiasis, living flesh, colonized by larvae, his body becoming a world for lower creatures, as his own empire slipped away. The gout merciless made even a feather's touch unbearable. Yet he had to be moved, cleaned. Each attempt wrung screams from his throat, cries that echoed down the marble corridors, hollowing the grandeur of El Escorial. The king who once watched flames devour heretics now pleaded for mercy from trembling servants, every plea a confession of defeat. Throughout this descent, Philip's mind remained sharp. That clarity was perhaps the cruelest wound. The king who had built the magnificent Escorial as a testament to Spanish glory and his own legacy now lay rotting within its walls, conscious of each new indignity visited upon his failing flesh. Majesty dissolved into rot, and with each breath he watched the edifice of his power crumble bone by bone beneath the weight of death. Imagine the scene. Demands mass in his chamber. The odor of incense mingles with the stench of suppurating wounds. Psalms are read over flesh that softens and splits their words, fragile bulwarks against corruption. Here, the man who once marshaled Catholic armies across Europe, the architect of orthodoxy, and dread summons the last relics of faith to his side, even as his body becomes a theater for ruin. There are moments, thin and trembling, between paroxysms of agony when he speaks, his voice raw, clinging to duty. He consults his heir, the future Philip III, over matters of empire, his sentences punctuated by shudders of pain. Outside, the sun beats mercilessly. Within, time thickens every second, a contest between memory and oblivion. By early September, a new and baser humiliation sets in. Diarrhea seeps from him uncontrollably, born of infection or the poisons pressed into him by trembling physicians. The filth accumulates, fouling sheets already heavy with sweat and blood, surrounding the king with the final democratic stench of mortality. His kidneys fail. Fluid gathers in his legs and belly, swelling him grotesquely. The stretched, fragile skin tears open raw wounds, blossoming to invite yet more infection, more worms. The court physician Garcia de Oñate records the fever and delirium, the unmistakable scent of sepsis thickening the air. Philip, half drowned in confusion, reaches for a crucifix, his father's crucifix, the last talisman of empire. In its cold weight, he searches for dignity, for some echo of sovereign purpose, as his body surrenders inch by inch to chaos. Treatments become torment. The doctrine of humors dictates daily bloodletting, the letting of strength and hope in crimson rivulets. Arsenic and mercury smeared on wounded flesh hiss and burn, hastening decay. Food is a memory. Broth-watered wine, soft bread, each a struggle. Infection and hunger wage their silent war within him. Blood lost day after day leaves him a husk, shivering beneath the weight of summer. His heart falters, skips races, breath shortens, the room seems to shrink. Even the weather becomes an accomplice. The heat of 1598 presses against the stone, turning the palace into an oven, an enormous mausoleum trapping both life and rot. Through it all, Philip endures, eyes wide, mind sharp enough to feel every indignity, every fresh betrayal of flesh. Here, in the crucible of El Escorial, sovereignty is stripped to its bones. The king who once commanded continents now lies besieged by filth fever and faith, his legacy reduced to sweat rot and the desperate clutch of a crucifix, a reminder that even emperors at the end are left to the mercies of worms and stone. The air itself has curdled thick, unbreathable heavy with the stench of royal flesh surrendering to rot. Fever eats at Philip's body, and the heat, imprisoned by shuttered windows meant to hide the stench, breeds armies of lice and flies, relentless in their torment. Their wings hum ceaselessly through the darkness, drawn to the oozing wounds, and sweet reek of decomposition. What breeze might bring relief is banished, trapped behind stone and protocol, as the miasma settles like a shroud over the dying king. By September's second week, the end is no longer a threat, but a promise. Philip remains conscious, his mind sharp as pain, surveying the ruins of his flesh. He calls for his children, demanding they witness the final performance of monarchy. The future Philip III enters, face pale, nostrils flaring, as he beholds what remains a father transformed into a writhing, infested relic, more corpse than king. The prince stumbles from the chamber again and again, overcome by the horror, by the vision, by the smell of Spain's sovereign reduced to a nest for vermin. In this moment, the last embers of royal duty flicker. Philip beckons his heir, the ruined hand, gesturing toward the evidence of fate's cruelty. His words are brittle, heavy with dread. "I have been treated like an old dog. Remember this when you wear the crown." Was it warning or bitter confession? None can say. Whether he meant to humble the future king or simply mourn his own abandonment, the lesson is carved deep into the air. Earthly power is a frail, vanishing dream. On September 13th, he asks for the final sacraments. The confessor approaches trembling to anoint what little flesh can bear the sacred oil without shattering into screams. Flies settle brazenly upon the ointment drawn to corruption no incense can mask. Grace and rot mingle on dying skin, a tableau of holy ritual and mortal futility. The walls of El Escorial bear witness the grandeur of God, entwined with the certainty of decay. The king's breath grows shallow, thick with the stench of drowning lungs and rotting organs. Each gasp rattles in the gloom, a death rattle that fills the marble halls with dread. At 5 a.m, beneath the gaze of the crucifix pressed to his wasted chest, Philip II finally succumbs. The Lord of Empire is conquered not by armies or kings, but by swarms of the smallest creatures, by the slow democracy of decomposition. And when the living retreat, the task of preparing the corpse begins, a final humiliation, for even in death decay claims the last word. In the dim silence of the Escorial, the last dignity owed to a king became an exercise in futility. Philip's corpse, ravaged beyond the skill of mortals, began to fall apart in the hands of his embalmers. Perfumes, spices, and alchemical unguents were heaped upon corrupted flesh in a desperate, frantic bid to conceal the stench and disguise the ruin. But rot is insatiable. The body, once armored in silk and gold, now betrayed its keepers, splitting, leaking, resisting every ritual and every prayer. Even the final procession was hurried shadows, pressing close as the casket was sealed with trembling haste and borne down to the crypt below. No time remained for pageantry or the comfort of tradition, only the most essential rites muttered over the decaying sovereign before he was entombed among the dust of fathers and wives, his physical collapse locked away behind stone, hidden from sight, if never from memory. Yet news seeped through walls thicker than any crypt. Across Europe, Philip's end became both warning and weapon. In Protestant England and the Netherlands, where his name conjured the Inquisition and the stake, his suffering was received with a grim, near-ecstatic glee. Pamphlets whispered of a king undone by the same cruelty he once wielded, rot and agony as divine retribution for blood spilled in distant wars and holy fires. Elizabeth of England, his old adversary, is said to have remarked, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." Even this perhaps was laced with a chill satisfaction. In Catholic Spain, the story changed. Chroniclers scrubbed the filth from their accounts, painting the king's last hours in the colors of piety and steadfastness. Official memory spoke only of sacraments received, of dynastic concern, of a monarch facing the end as he had lived stoic, devout, unbroken. The Spanish people mourned not the collapse of flesh, but the passing of an ideal, never glimpsing the crawling horror sealed beneath stone. Modern eyes, less merciful, peel back the story to the bone. Physicians now believe his gout, long a torment, had twisted into rheumatoid agony, his body wrecked further by diabetes and its thirst, his blood a banquet for infection. Abscesses and ulcers invited in the crawling multitude. Stage 4 sores opened the gates for maggots to feast. A staphylococcal plague raged beneath the royal skin, claiming inch after inch, until the monarch's last fortress was nothing but carrion. But perhaps most chilling was the inversion that played out in those final hours. Here was a man who had sent thousands to die at his word, now unable to command the smallest of creatures. Power was revealed as an illusion, decay as the final law. The king who ruled the world could not rule the worms within his flesh. The body of the man who once ruled the world now lay beyond the art of preservation, a ruin already claimed by corruption before the grave could close over him. The embalmers' faces, masked with resignation, labored beneath the flicker of failing candlelight. Every movement threatened to tear the monarch's remains apart, skin-splitting bone loosening the flesh, dissolving beneath their desperate hands. Perfumes and spices mingled with the stench of rot rising in clouds that could not mask the truth: the king was rotting faster than ritual could redeem him. No procession, no display of royal majesty could endure the relentless decay. The ceremonies shrank to their barest form, prayers rushed, and eyes averted. In the end, the sealed casket was borne hurriedly through the marble corridors of El Escorial, that cold mausoleum the king himself had built. Philip was lowered into the crypt alongside his father and wives, his corrupted body hidden, but the memory of his decline impossible to bury. Word of the king's horrific undoing raced across Europe. In Protestant lands, England, the Netherlands, the suffering of the Catholic tyrant was received with cruel satisfaction. Pamphlets relished the spectacle of royal flesh succumbing to filth, pronouncing his death a fitting price for the fires of the Inquisition and the blood spilled in Flanders. In England, it was whispered that Queen Elizabeth herself remarked, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." Even for adversaries, the spectacle was a grim mirror. In Spain, the truth was embalmed in silence. Chronicles glossed over the stench, and the maggots painting Philip's passing in tones of dignity and devotion. The people were told their king had died as he had lived, steadfast, pious, unconquered. The walls of El Escorial, heavy with secrets, kept their silence. Historians now unravel the litany of agonies that consumed him. Gout warped into rheumatoid torment, his body racked by unending pain. Diabetes unspoken brewed thirst and swelling weakening every defense. Immobility opened wounds that invited the crawling things, a staphylococcal siege, turning flesh to a feast. The king's decline was not merely medical, it was a grotesque inversion of sovereignty itself. The man who ordered thousands to their deaths could not command the worms to leave his own flesh. So ends the story of Philip II, power stripped to the bone, the king reduced to carrion. In the end, no empire could shield him from the democracy of decay. A monarch once thought untouchable, crowned in the myth of his own divinity, now stripped to raw humanity. His death is a specter that haunts the marble halls, a final brutal lesson that the abyss between dominion and despair is narrower than any crown would have us believe. Philip II, who had ruled continents and commanded the fates of nations, found his last dominion to be a prison of flesh, a body revolting in slow rebellion, immune to decree or prayer. The man who once bent the world to his will discovered in those fevered, stinking days that he could not command the slow unmaking of his bones, nor silence the relentless gnawing beneath his skin. In this, the theater of agony, he learned what all rulers must: the body will not be governed. Power ends at the edge of the skin. His conquests, lands, fleets, dynasties dissolve now into a single, undying image. A king devoured not after death, as is the fate of all, but in cruel consciousness, alive to every bite, every indignity. He left this world not on a field of victory, nor in the comfort of kin, but in a drawn-out nightmare, rotting, swarmed by vermin, surrounded by shadows and silence. So history's judgment lingers not in the shadow of empires raised, but in the manner of their unraveling. The greatest of monarchs reduced to food for worms, while his mind still thrashed inside a failing body, a lesson that clings to the memory long after marble effigies have crumbled. And as we step away from this darkness echoing through the corridors of the Escorial, a line surfaces from among his last haunted words: "To have been and not to be is not to be at all." For a king obsessed with the permanence of his name, there is a cruel symmetry. He is remembered not for the world he ruled, but for the spectacle of his undoing. His death has eclipsed his triumphs, searing a single indelible truth into our bones: all power rots, all glory fades, and the democracy of dust will claim kings and beggars alike, sometimes inch by excruciating inch.